up is Betti Marenko, who's a design theorist with a background in sociology, philosophy and cultural studies. She investigates the role that design studies, continental philosophy and digital cultures play in shaping possible futures. She's a co-editor of the volume Deleuze in Design with Edinburgh University Press 2015 and is currently writing a book titled Digital Uncertainty Between Prediction and Potential in Algorithmic Culture. And she leads the BA Product Design Contextual Studies program at CSM. And we've worked together often over the past 15 years or so, and I'm very grateful that you're here today.
Thank you, Maggie. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really delighted to be here. So yes, I have a background in philosophy. I work in design at Centre St. Martin's, and all my work is located between design and philosophy. I like to say that I'm trying to think about design like a philosopher, and I'm trying to think about philosophy like a designer. And I'm interested in how design theory and design practice can work together to interrogate critically current regimes of algorithmic prediction and foreclosure of futures that algorithmic prediction is creating. And I'm interested in how design can figure out alternative strategies to, rooted in speculative method, imaginative storytelling, and especially divinatory practices. So I've been looking at the narratives, the discourses, and the superstitions circulating around AI, artificial intelligence, and the stories we tell each other about the algorithms, not only as technological objects, but as cultural objects, as designed objects. Some may even say the product of sociopathic design. And within these discourses, there are some tension between the trust we place in algorithms as sort of digital oracles and the fact that there is a huge margin of unknowability within the system, to the point that sometimes even programmers can't really grasp fully the functioning. So I'm very much interested in this unknowability, which in this book I'm writing, I call digital uncertainty, and a provisional definition will be the potential for computational outcomes that are not entirely predicted or programmed. So of course there are all there is a scholarship and the literature concerning the opacity of the algorithms and the black boxing. But for me, what is more interesting is how can design capitalize on uncertainty and indeterminacy in order to use them as creative resources to imagine not only new modes of interacting with the machine, but perhaps also to develop new modes of thinking, new modes of existing, and maybe also, to quote you, Simon, to mobilize magical modes of being. Now, if we start thinking about the narratives, the stories we tell each other about AI and intelligent machines, and we try to look beyond techno-determinism, techno-euphoria, and techno-dystopia, it seems to me that what is at stake has less to do with technology and more to do with imagination, or to put it, better, with the crisis of the imagination. So how do we imagine alternative stories, different stories, especially to get out of the notion that technologies are neutral tools, which is a very naive idea. Machines are never a technical category, they're always a social one. And as I was thinking about this talk, I happened to reread the manifesto of Mechanism by the extraordinary Italian designer Bruno Munari, and I'm going to share a short quotation with you. He says, today's world is a world of machines. We live among machines, they help us with everything we do in our work and recreation. But what do we know about their moods, their natures, the animal defects, if not through arid and pedantic technical knowledge? Machines reproduce themselves faster than mankind, almost as fast as the most prolific of insects. They already force us to busy ourselves with them, to spend a great deal of time taking care of them. They have spoiled us. We have to keep them clean, provide them with nourishment and rest, continually attend to them, and meet their every need. In a few years' time, we will become their little slaves. Now, Bruno Munari wrote this in 1938, so 80 years ago. And of course, he was very aware of the danger of fetishizing technology, and also this is the time, the post-futurist time. And indeed, in the manifesto, he then goes on to say that machines must become works of art. And then, of course, he develops his very famous useless machines, which are machines that don't produce anything, they don't save time, they don't save labor, but are simply machines to look at. And he says, look at in the way one looks at a drifting group of clouds after spending 7 hours in a factory populated with useful machines. Now, why I'm showing this? Because a lot of the discussion and the stories we tell each other express anxiety, curiosity, delight, fear, and they're not new at all. These issues emerge also in the way in which humans and technologies and machines have approached each other in the past. Some of the other work I'm doing has to do with 18th century automata, and the type of debates and conversation in the 18th century were very similar to the one we have now in relation to AI. So how do we speculate about a more imaginative AI? Simondon says that the main issue is that human misunderstand technology. He says at the very beginning of his book, the opposition drawn between culture and techniques, between man and machine, is false and has no foundation. It is merely a sign of ignorance or resentment. So machines are fundamentally misunderstood because there is a sort of wedge between technology and culture, almost as if humans forget that technological objects do evolve and humans evolve with them. And this, of course, is the notion of technogenesis that has been already mentioned. So whether we're looking at keys or engines or AI or algorithms, technical objects keep on evolving. They're the technical expression of a spontaneous evolution, which doesn't depend on natural processes and nor entirely on the intention of the designer, but they're the result of a process that propelled them beyond the intention of the inventor or the designer. And I think this is an interesting idea to think about artificial intelligence, because what if artificial intelligence as well is an increasingly autonomous object, while at the same time being both technological and cultural? So as AI evolves, so humanity evolves. And there is this process of coevolution. Ultimately, humans are always among machines and vice versa. And often this is a notion that is forgotten in a lot of other fields. Now, if we push this idea further, it also means that it makes little sense to talk about artificial intelligence. We can even say that there is only one intelligence. Keeps on evolving, keeps on co-evolving, and there is only one. Now, another aspect that Simondon underlines concerning the misunderstanding between human and machines has to do with the warped notion of the importance of automatism. He says that those who worship machines think that the more automatism there is, the better the machine will be. So the ultimate terminal machine of all machines. But automatism, for Simondon, is a low degree of technical perfection, which means that a truly evolved machine is based not on an increase of automatism, but on increased margins of indeterminacy. Indeterminacy is the condition for the evolution of the machine, which means co-evolution, so evolution of the human as well. Now, is it possible to use these ideas to think about a more uncertain, indeterminate form of AI? So as I was pondering this, I came across an article on the MIT Technology Review a few months ago, and there was a very interesting piece about deep learning developing the capacity to self-doubt and to sense uncertainty. So instead of having a yes and no AI, we have a maybe AI, which is learning how to introduce indeterminacy in the outcomes. So in a sense, more attuned to the nuances, the unpredictability, and the true mess of real life and complex systems. And somehow this shows something quite relevant, that at the industry level, at R&D is for sure, uncertainty, which is a key aspect of human conditioning of the world, is beginning to be recognized as something that needs to be increasingly essential to develop AI and new relationship between human and machine. Now, another way of putting this is to say that no partnership between human and machine is possible unless imperfect information enter into the equation. And imperfect information is simply information that is asymmetrically distributed, so not every stakeholder has the same access to information. And the classic example is poker. Now, very recently, an AI called Libratus beat the world's best professional poker players, precisely because the AI was able to rely on imperfect information. And the interesting thing is that unlike AlphaGo that learned by analyzing about 30 million games, Libratus was simply given a description of the game and then left to find out his way through it. So what Libratus had to do was to learn how to bluff, how to randomize its action, and how to play poker. And of course he won. Now, poker has been one of the hardest games to crack for AI, precisely because of this asymmetrically distributed information. And this seems an interesting innovation in terms of what AI can do or cannot do. And of course, we can understand what is the value in the industry for an AI that is able to capitalize on uncertainty, because it will be able to model strategically the negotiation in the real world, where simply there's not enough information or information is not available, whether it's finance or driverless cars. So I started thinking then, what kind of AI would be uncertain? How would an uncertain AI sort of behave? With hesitation, with some sort of caution, with some sort of embarrassment or awkwardness? What kind of uncertain AI we can imagine? And more to the point, is it possible to actually feed messy data and noise in order to train AI to be alert to the complexity and the contradiction and the true confusion of the world, maybe the chaos of the world? So I have so many questions. Can AI get smarter by becoming more uncertain and by learning that there are things it does not know? And at this point, I need to zoom out and leave AI, because this question concerns what counts as knowledge. What is knowledge? How do we make knowledge? And here, I'm using the work of a fantastic Italian historian called Carlo Ginzburg, who has written about this idea of making conjecture as a type of knowledge production that allows for element of chance and unpredictability to enter into the outcome. And he uses this wonderful expression, elastic rigor, to explain the almost paradoxical nature of this type of knowledge production, where factors enter in the production of knowledge that are simply not measurable, but are qualitative and situated. Ultimately, it's a knowledge of what is not known. And the examples Ginzburg offers are intuition and divination. Now, divination presupposes a type of knowledge hidden in science, a knowledge that cannot be known, but only recognized by observing traces, for instance, in tracking or observing the fly path of birds, and by making conjecture. And George Agamben also has written about divination, and he says that divination is ultimately a knowledge without a subject. I also use Joshua Ramey's take on divination, and this is a fantastic book which I completely recommend, as an ongoing inquiry into the unknown that uses chance as an opportunity to make meaning. Now, divinatory practice become important not because they offer definitive answer, most certainly don't, or a clear-cut decision-making techniques, no, they don't. But because they're a process of speculating into uncertainty that can accommodate enigmatic, equivocal, or even conflicting meaning. And this ambiguity must be treasured if you want to inhabit the contingency of the world. I think it's this act of inquiry that set possible possibles in motion, cracking new openings to redefine what will have been possible. Now, it's important to remember that for the Greeks, the conjectural method was the domain of Metis. Now, Metis was the goddess of cunning intelligence and craftiness, and represented divination by means of water. So hold on this thought. Now, it seems to me that this type of imaginative, speculative inquiry ongoing into the possible, which is also very crafty and cunning, is very much needed to address common modes of algorithmic governmentality. And the real target of algorithmic governmentality, quoting Antoinette Rouvroy, is the inactual potential dimensions of human existence. It's the dimension of virtuality, the conditional mode of what people could do, their potency or agency. So what they could do, but they won't. So when reality is being reduced to what can be predicted, when profiling exhausts the potential, which could go in many directions, but then won't, yeah? And when the excess of the possible, the mass of the unpredictable is captured, quantified, and flattened into the only viable version of the real, now then I think it becomes quite pressing, whether we are artists, designers, theorists, it doesn't matter. It becomes pressing to insert forms of complication, to reclaim a mode of inquiry that lean of uncertainty, and to make a stand in favor of potential. Now, let's not forget the potential is always also the potential not to do something, not to engage, yeah? The potential not to act. And I'm sure you're familiar with this, but this not is very well beautifully expressed by Deleuze's reading of Herman Melville, Barter by the Scrivener. And I like in particular George Agamben's reading of this novel. For Agamben, the radical utterance of Bartleby, I would prefer not to, is the true formula of creation. So in affirming the power to, as well as the power not to, this stance breaks with received expectations and disrupts the prediction. And is almost a state of suspension, yeah? Not engaging, not refusing, which becomes the very condition of possibility. Almost an experiment that signals that contingency that might be or might not be is actually the space of freedom. Now, all this emphasis on the power of potential, for this talk I call the power of maybes, which I also argue is a political space. For me it's important working with design because I think it should be taken on board by speculative and critical design as the process of building the world, building the future, acting the present to give shape to tomorrow. That's what design is, after all. But unfortunately, design is not doing this. In fact, I would say that the speculative design it's a bit of a narrow version of speculation. because it rests on a very future-fixed and solutionist kind of approach. And an example of this is one of those iconic tropes circulating in design and for many years, which is the Futures Cone. I don't know how many designers are in the room. I know one for sure. This is a form of modeling and diagramming the future, but in a present saturated by computational prediction, this diagram fails to capture the continuous diagramming of the future by machines. Also, I have to say this diagram is being appropriated in corporate mainstream environments, completely stripped bare of political connotations, which it used to have originally. And specifically how aspect of the preferable, these bits of the preferable, those bits that sit outside the possible, might have a political type of engagement, some sort of activist, even utopian, practical type of action. Now, the preferable in the cone is where the politics are, and this perhaps is the space of the maybes I'm thinking about. And of course, a narrow view of speculation in design for me is a political problem. That's why I like a notion of speculation that is less future fixed, and is also less fixed on explaining, on providing solutions, and on resolving. But instead is more of a practice that tries to maximize friction and maximize problems rather than offering solution. And uses making conjecture, using divination practices that require invention, patience, and a lack of concern for the need to resolve differences. Now, I like to call this approach, which is just another name, future crafting. So the activity of giving shape to the future, but here and now. So the future is about speculating on what might happen, but without falling into the trap of prescribing the future, of saying what the future should be, which is what design often ends up doing. But instead kind of grabbing the future and using an inquiry into the unknown in order to make some models. And bringing it back into the present, which is the crafting part, which has to do with practice, with materiality, with craft, but also with craftiness, and with some sort of kind of intelligence, which is Betti's lady. So, future crafting, speculation by design, as a strategy to make conjecture, and as a stratagem to conjure new images to think with. And here I'm borrowing Isabel Stenger's words on speculative methodologies. So perhaps future crafting can be aligned to this as a practice that affirms the possible, that actively resists the plausible and the probable, targeted by approaches that claim to be neutral. And I like to imagine a future crafting approach in design that should be forensic, because uses actually material object as witness. It should be diagnostic, because it uses also trivial element of reality to create some sort of interrogative hypothesis, and certainly has to be divinatory, because it uses chance as a way to make meaning, as an inquiry into the unknown. At this point, I have to zoom out a little bit again, because the issue of the political shortcoming of design is really bothering me. And in order to think through this, I've enlisted the help of Félix Guattari. Now, I come across this quotation, which I'm going to share with you, in the Lines of Flight. People are so lost, so maddened by the deterritorialization of the gears of the social, of space and time, like frightened animals, the power feels the need to calm them down, to put soft musics in lifts, to make them parade, and to channel them in a continuous space modeled by design techniques. Now, the bit that is more interesting for me here, as you can imagine, is this uneasy alliance between regimes of powers and design techniques. But there are several Guattari themes. How do we analyze the forces traversing society? How do we look at the maneuvers of power in the constitutional subjectivity? Are very, very much needed and more relevant now than when it was writing this in 1979. So some of the questions are, how do we understand subjectification processes in a regime of algorithmic governmentality? How do we invent concepts to understand these processes and also to understand how they change? And how do we design critical intervention to make this process an object of inquiry? Now, a useful concept I found in Guattari, again, to really unpack these ideas is this: the general collective equipments. On an immediate level, this notion refers to infrastructures of life and work. So think about transport infrastructures, the road, but also the sewage systems, and the plumbing in a city. Think about education infrastructure, the schools, the universities, health, hospitals, your local swimming pools, all urban infrastructure in particular. So there is a convergence of architecture, materiality, design, process of subjectification, material forces, etc. This on immediate level. However, the collective equipments are actually more than infrastructure. They concern structures and relations that, yes, are material, spatialized, and architectural, but they're also symbolic. Guattari says, and I'm quoting, not just walls, offices, circulations, transmissions of orders and information, but also, and above all, a modeling of attitudes, of ritual, of submissions, that are imposed across multiple semiotic components. Basically, everything that, in a narrow perspective of urban planners, is seen as passive infrastructure, as opposed to activities such as the offices, the businesses, the shops, the factories, is an example of collective equipments. And interestingly, there isn't a single agency or a single stakeholder that has the control of the collective equipments, says Guattari. They're sort of autonomous and they operate independently from individual will and intention. Guattari also goes on to say that the collective equipment is actually the social unconscious. And we consume them. We consume care, leisure time, green space, we consume culture, mobility, education, etc. Now, to give a little bit of context, a lot of these ideas were developed in the late 60s, early 70s by the Center for Institutional Study, Research and Training located in France. It was an interesting mix of activists, philosophers, social scientists, urban planners, and was quite a fluid collective. But the interesting thing it was that they got government funding to provide the government with information analysis on social change to inform policy making. And there is a really good biography of Deleuze and Guattari called Intersecting Lives by François Dos, and he has a lot of interesting anecdotes of the way in which the collective was using and redistributing the funds from the French government. And you have to imagine that after the 1968, the government was quite anxious to really hire social scientists to understand what was going on. So they decided to hire this group. Now, the center declared mission was to propose imaginative and radical analysis that could inform policy, especially in the field of urban planning. And they published this journal called Research. And this issue that you see there, number 13, that was published in December 1973, was the issue that introduced the notion of equipment of power. And a notion that was described as a specific historical reality where power, territory, architecture, modes of production, institutional apparatuses, and processes of subjectification were converging. And this issue in particular was also responding to that essay that you see there, La Ville Ordinateur, the computer city, which was published the year before, written by Fourquet and Moran, and it's quite an extraordinary essay, because they say the city, and I'm quoting, the city is not an external inert space, the city is a computer that makes its own program, it is an information machine, yeah? Now, you find a lot of this discussion in the book Foucault Live, I think. Okay. Now, back to the collective equipments. They are always plural, of course. They're always a constellation. I took this photo at the Andres Gorky exhibition. I thought it fit the bill. So the key function of collective equipments is to produce a society. But they also do a lot of recording, fixing, stocking of social fluxes, whether we're talking about fluxes of people, objects, money, or information. So they have an immobilizing effect, especially in relation to the production of subjectivity. So some of the questions that I've started thinking at this point are how collective equipments actually produce behavior, design behaviors, and design subjects, and how the production of goods and architectural spatialized infrastructure also interact with the production of subjects, and where are the escape routes. And of course I insist on the term design because collective equipments design subjectivities, yeah? So in a sense it's also an interesting way of looking at design, not as a practice that designs the environment, but vice versa, it's the environment that designing the subject. Now, for Guattari, this process of designing and constituting subject through general equipments happens through capillary distribution and miniaturization. So he actually talks about an omnipresent, immanent super equipment that is everywhere and nowhere at once, which is an interesting image, quite evocative. And he says that multiplies its face with its central black hole eye. And I like this image because it seems to me that this omnipresent, immanent, miniaturized super equipment with the central black whole eye is quite illuminating to think about algorithmic governmentality, back to that. And of course, it's not a monolithic apparatus, as it never is. And Guattari gives us also some interesting way to plot escape routes. And that's why it talks about the optional matter or option machine, which is defined as the crystal of the possible. Transformational matter, through which it's possible to carve pathways across and through the general collective equipments or the super equipments. And yes, in a sense, this is the tension, the dynamic between molar and molecular, but there's something a bit more here. I like the reference to crystals. I like the reference to matter, which for me matters a lot. So it's an option machine. It's a subtle matter with the power to undo the equipment, and it's the matter that afford individual and collective capacity to act, to choose, to make a stance, to do, or perhaps not. Yeah, to go back to Agamben. Guattari is very clear on this. He wants to show how this option machine is produced and mobilized behind the supposedly neutral architectural and institutional facades of these equipments. By what procedure situations that are apparently open are played out in advance, and that the real margin of choice can nonetheless subsist for people who want to escape from the system. Given a grading of equipment, what politics of a collective assemblage is it possible to envisage? where to begin? I love this quotation. Now, the reason why I love it is because these instances I have turned red seems to me to really address very well what's going on now in terms of algorithmic governmentality. Now, we have a collective equipment with an architecture and institutional facade that appear to be neutral. We have situations that appear to be open but are actually played out in advance, which is the foreclosure of the futures in algorithmic prediction. And there is this notion of a collective equipment organized as a grid. So is it possible to take this idea from Guattari and then to wedge it in our present condition? And if it's possible, then the question is, what kind of optional matter, what kind of optional machine is needed to introduce a diagrammatic disorder in the system of algorithmic governmentality? And here I'm going to give you a little preview of the work I'm doing with David Banquet, who is here, the designer in the room. We're doing this work together called Speculative Diagrams Plotting to Reclaim Algorithmic Prediction. And the idea is that to really work on the space of potential that can be reclaimed by speculating how to diagram uncertainty, perhaps a sort of algorithmic divination. And of course, to talk about divination and conjectural knowledge should not be misinterpreted as a rejection of technologies. We're not Luddite, and it's not even a rejection of scientific knowledge or all the other form of knowledge. On the contrary, has to be taken as a strategic intervention by design that counteracts the pseudoscience of contemporary data occultism like Palantir Data Mining Company and the techno-determinism allegedly objective. Yeah? So some of the questions that David and I are working through are these. Can machine predict anything other than a coarse conservative version of the past? How do we contrast the algorithmic maneuvers that count the possible by turning it into the probable? How do we diagram potential? And here I'm quoting Stengers and Debase, all those might-haves or could-bes implicit in situations. And I say, and I'm wrapping up here, we need a crafty, cunning, conjectural mode of inquiry. So it's back to Metis again. In the classical icon of Metis is Odysseus, the trickster, the man with a lot of technical knowledge and a lot of cunning intelligence. But there is another classic embodiment of Metis, non-human and tentacular and equally crafty. And here, of course, I sneak in my octopus, Maggie. And I'm going to leave you by sharing with you this poem from mid-6th century before Christ. Adopt the disposition of the octopus, crafty in its convolutions, which takes on the appearance of whatever rock it has dealings with. At one moment, follow along this way, but at the next, change the color of your skin. You can be sure that cleverness proves better than inflexibility. Thank you.
Talk to the Society of Artistic Research in Paris, Spike Island, and recent exhibitions include the Dakar Biennale, the Showroom, Konsthal in Stockholm, the Forensic Architecture Show, and the MACBA in Barcelona and MUAC in Mexico City. I should say that kind of one, for me as a colleague, one of the great things about Ayesha is she's completely transverses between practice and theory, and basically is developing the performance lecture kind of format. So I'm absolutely delighted, and it's great that she's here to talk to us. So Ayesha.
Thanks, Simon. I just want to thank Maggie. Where's Maggie? Thank you for inviting me to do this. I'm a long-term fan, first-time caller. So happy to be here. So I'm going to talk about my project, Black Atlantis, which is a series of lecture performances, films, and sound works, where each chapter is a collection of images and sounds that look at the Black Atlantic and its afterlives in contemporary legalized migration at sea, in oceanic environments, through Afrofuturistic dance floors and sound systems, and in outer space. Using Walter Benjamin's concept of the dialectical image, I examine how to think through sound, image, water, violence, and history as elements of an active archive, and of time travel as a historical method. So this project combines two discourses, Afrofuturism and the Anthropocene, and it follows the work of Phil Sternberg, the geographer, who critiques discourses of Black Atlantic because he says it focuses on the surfaces of the water rather than the depths of the ocean. And as a result of this, what is lost is the wetness of the ocean, and therefore its haptic, tactile quality is lost as well. So like Simon says, I've been doing a series of lecture performances on this theme, and there's about 5 parts now. And some of you might have seen some of them, and so I thought I wouldn't do one right now. I also don't know how to do one in half an hour. But I'm kind of now at a stage where I'm trying to think of how they accumulate and what form they could take together. Like how, once you've done 5 of these chapters, like what kind of other entity could it become? So, Maggie's invitation was to do something like a kind of work in progress. So I kind of took that up quite literally to sort of think about this as a way of sort of presenting elements of different performances, lecture performances and films that I've made around this theme, kind of like a presentation of the best of. But trying to think about this accumulation of these different chapters as an excuse to think about modes of immersion, subjectivity, terrain, environments, but also the objectness or the object quality of writing and the materiality of space it could take up. So a key methodological thread of Black Atlantis is to take the story of Drexia, an electronic band from Detroit whose mythos, built from liner notes, describe a story where the children born of pregnant slaves thrown overboard were able to adapt to living underwater as they went straight from living in amniotic fluid to ocean water, and so built a Black Atlantis called Drexia. Using Drexia as a method brings the Black Atlantic below the water, with its imaginary of a Black Atlantis comprised of former slaves living underwater. What wetness brings back to the table is a sense of the haptic, the sensory, the bodily, and the epidermal. And what below the water brings, and Atlantis brings, is the sense of the bottom of the sea, the volume of the water, the materiality of the space of the ocean, and other protagonists that inhabit the sea. And finally, what Drexia brings into this is time travel as a historical method. So like I said, this is a bit of a smorgasbord of the best of. So here's a little snippet of the first Black Atlantis I did called Bodies and Storms. In 1840, J.M.W. Turner painted slavers throwing overboard, the dead and dying, typhoon coming on. The sky is red and purple and gold and blue, which shifts to frothy white. In the white, a ship's masts faintly recede. The water is brown. In the right-hand corner is a leg with a manacle around the ankle. There is perhaps a shadow of an arm, but it's hard to tell, as in the water around it are the ghostly maws of fish with puckered mouths and dark eyes, and seagulls diving into the water. In 1781, the crew of the English slave ship Zong threw their slaves overboard in a calculus that determined that the insurance money for their death was worth more than the profit gained from selling their lives. As ships crossed the Atlantic, it was a common practice for the captain and crew to jettison cargo in storms. But in a few instances, such as on the Zong, it was the slaves who were thrown overboard, an action that raised the issue of whether slaves were legally defined as people or property, and what constituted an unforeseeable event, what in insurance term would be defined as an act of God. This was an ambivalence that played out in insurance claims in court in art and literature, in the fueling of the abolitionist movement, through a cast of characters that included the weather, slaves on boats, and the boats themselves. So in any account of the slave ship Zong, Turner Slavers, this painting, is the image that accompanies it. But as the Atlantic historian James Walvin points out, in fact, this isn't the Zong. There is no image of the Zong, and nor was there a storm at sea that precipitated the massacre. But be that as it may, this painting is a stand-in for the Zong massacre, which has no image and happened on still waters. In the storm, the water, the limbs of slaves, the mouths of hungry fish, and the gawping birds become the ecology of the brown water of the sea. I keep returning to the fact that there was no typhoon, that the storm is an imagined one that has become appended to the lore of this slave ship. So how is it possible to append a storm to this massacre on the Zong? Or in other words, what is it about storms, and what does it mean to imagine one onto history? Storms become a point of entry to think about how nature in flux is invoked in a socio-historical inquiry. Which, strangely enough, leads us to an electronic band from Drexciya that I just talked from Detroit called Drexciya, which I just told you about. And like I said, their mythos is about the adaptation of unborn fetuses from living in amniotic fluid to living underwater. And they sort of built this mythos through a series of albums, but they kind of consolidated it in this album called The Quest. And what they have here is the story of, in their own words, during the greatest Holocaust the world has ever known, pregnant America-bound African slaves were thrown overboard by the thousands during labor for being sick and disruptive cargo. Is it possible that they could have given birth at sea to babies that never needed air? Are Drexcians water-breathing, aquatically mutated descendants of those unfortunate victims of human greed? Recent experiments have shown a premature infant saved from certain death by breathing liquid oxygen through its underdeveloped lungs. And what you have here are the kind of rewriting of this history in 4 phases. For some reason I've said 3, but as we can see, there's obviously 4. So it starts off with the triangular trade at the top, the slave trade on top. And then the second phase is the migration route of rural blacks to northern cities. And then the third phase is techno leaves Detroit and spreads worldwide in 1988. And then finally we have the journey home, which is marked out as the future, no dates, but also the lines have no directions, there's no arrows, they're just radiating either towards or away from West Africa to the Americas. Okay, so that's an excerpt of the first chapter. The second, chapter 2. This is another piece I did that's called the Plantation of Scene. And I'm just going to dive in. Speed. This is my first evening at Walker's, once a sugar plantation and now a dairy. It is dusk. I step outside of the flat, climb the slightly mossy stairs, and turn right into the purpling light. To my left are horse stables. Behind me is the house, and in front of me are fields of grass. The sound of the frogs begins at dusk, and it gets louder. The paved drive I'm walking on ends at the field, and I turn right onto a dirt path. The grass is long on either side of the path. When I reach a lone tree to my left, the path dips down a small hill and continues to a line of trees in the distance. To the right is the south, and there are some twinkling lights in the distance. A small bat swoops over my head. Underneath the alien and screechy whir of the frogs, there is a silence. A black dog runs up to me from the big house and then turns around and goes back, looking back at me as if getting me to try to follow it. I walk away from it and into the long grass and listen. The frogs get louder. The sky turns black. What is the relationship between climate change and plantation economies? This is an exploration of many things. visiting the heartland of one of the 3 stops of the triangular trade, and taking seriously Donna Haraway and Anna Singh's use of the term Plantation of Scene, which connects the development of a plantation form of production to the beginning of the current geological era that we find ourselves in. The Plantation of Scene is a placeholder for the relationship between agriculture and the new geological era that we find ourselves called the Anthropocene. But the kind of agriculture that Singh and Haraway are thinking about consists of the violent replacement of diverse farming tactics, of forests and of pastures by the factory-like extractive structure of plantations, the cultivation of single crops like sugar and cotton for export, produced by enslaved and indentured laboring bodies, forcibly transported across long distances. Plantations eradicate the diversity of what is cultivated, devastating the land, violently exploiting and expropriating the bodies working on the land, and destroying any possible autonomy for self-sustenance for those living in these areas. So it's a nearly impossible endeavor to read an over 300-year-old history of plantations and their continually evolving social relations in the wake of one of the oldest instances of plantation slavery, and in the continued presence of descendants of slaves and plantation owners and overseers. All of this against the slow temporal swings that mark climate change. Reading a still living and present history against a slowly unraveling future of increasing frequencies of natural disaster, the warming of the ocean, the jeopardization of sea life, is incommensurable and probably pointless, actually, as they operate on such different registers, and the possibility of finding common ground at ground level is nearly nil. So what I'm trying to do is examine a set of residues that could hint at both registers. Another beginning. It's 2:30, and I've been waiting in the parking lot outside of Harrison's Cave for about 30 minutes. Tour buses and hired taxis efficiently pull in and out of the parking spaces, loading and unloading their American passengers. 2 men are chatting beside me. One of them offers the other a lift, and they walk over to a brightly painted bus. I figure I have 20 minutes more to wait. I hear a loud noise and look up from my book to see a diesel-powered minibus hurtling towards the lot like a getaway car for a heist. It abruptly stops at a hasty angle near the bus stop where I'm sitting. The sign on the bus just says, "City." People climb out quickly with the diesel engine rumbling. As I climb the stairs, the bus speeds up again, so fast that I trip onto my seat. I pull myself up, holding out my $2 to the driver with an apologetic, "Excuse me," and the man in the passenger seat waves impatiently at me to sit down. I look out the window as the bus hurtles down dirt roads hewn through fields of cane, speckled with sun and dust. We come to another stop, and the engine grumbles and roars. Outside are the fields of cane and the men and women waiting on the other side of the road. Okay, I feel like I'm really hurtling through this. I'm gonna talk about another chapter. So you've seen Bodies and Storms, and you've seen the Plantation of Scene, little bits of them at least. And here's another chapter that's actually qualitatively quite different from the others. It's called The End of Eating Everything, and it takes its title from a work by Wangechi Mutu that she made with the artist Santigold, the musician Santigold. And it considers what Drexians or what other creatures underwater are consuming underwater. So whether they're consuming each other, and also what kind of boundaries are being eroded between the whats and who's of being eaten. So who's eating what. And I did this performance with I did this piece with Tom Hurst, who's an electronic musician. And so it's about 60 minutes long. And what we do is we sort of live mix about 5 different tracks of sound, which includes work. I mean, the motivation behind it was to actually use Drexciya more tangibly, use their music. But what we do is we mix it with pre-recorded voiceovers by Fred Moten, Stefano Harney, H.P. Lovecraft, Christina Sharp, but also David Attenborough, nautical historians, and then we also do some live voiceovers at the same time. So it's kind of quite an elaborate piece. And so I'm going to play a short excerpt from. I'm sort of struggling with how to reconstruct it. So I have an audio that was like an audio recording from this piece or this performance that we did at the Camden Art Center in January, superimposed with the videos that we projected. So what you see here in the background, you'll see the videos for that. And I guess all I can say is that it's in 4 parts usually. The first part's on clocks and stars. The second part is called Cities Under the Sea. The third part's called Monsters. And the fourth part is called Coasts. And actually, Tom and I are developing this piece for one of Hyperdub's Zero Nights at Corsica Studios. So that's another sort of future iteration of this. How much time? Do I have a lot of time, or do I have like a medium amount of time?
Another 5-10 minutes or so.
Okay, yeah, that's fine. 10 I can do, okay.
In 1997, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration discovered a very powerful ultra-low frequency sound that they called the bloop. Picked up near the southern tip of South America, the sound was detectable from over 5,000 kilometers away. Its audio profile resembled that of a living creature. Researchers noticed that the sound varied rapidly in frequency, which is characteristic of marine animals. This begged the question, was there a creature even bigger than a blue whale lurking at the bottom of the sea? They eventually decided that the sound came from a large ice break at the bottom of the ocean.
In 2008, M. Norbisi Philip published Song, a cycle of poems marking the massacre of slaves thrown from the slave ship Song in 1781. All the poems draw from the 2-page document surviving the Gilbert v. Gregson court case, the insurance claim made in court after the jettisoning. In this poem, the word water is splintered across the length of the page. And under a line at the bottom of the page is a list of imagined names of the slaves thrown overboard. When performed, the word water is stretched out. Philip pulls the word to its breaking point. It sounds like she is drowning. In pronouncing the word water, water becomes both the subject and the object of drowning. It is painful and violent.
The sound of drowning in Philip's performance of Song, and particularly the word water, makes the voice into something not human. It crosses the threshold between the human and the environment underwater. The sound of the word water and its meaning is as ambiguous as the blue, but the word water crosses the threshold from the opposite direction, where the human voice becomes something monstrous. In the sound of the word water is the horror of hearing a voice stretching beyond human detection towards its own annihilation. This measures the horror embedded in Drexciya's imagining of the possibility of life growing in the bodies of enslaved women thrown overboard.
Right now, you are watching an excerpt of a video by Wangechi Mutu called The End of Eating Everything. There's a machine creature that looks like a tick. It swims in the water or in the sneezes, and blood comes out of its mouth and stains its atmosphere. Water runs through the story, and water is the medium of the feminine, called to the forefront by the amniotic fluid that Drexia sees as the primary medium that gave birth to underwater life after the jettison. The wombs of these women massacred become the site of potential survival below water. The ship is a womb that holds within the hold the slaves transported into slavery. It raises the question, to what extent is horror a fuel for resistance, and to what extent is adaptation a form of agency?
Mazus, Zuwena, Ogunsheye, Ziyad, Ogwambi, Ketura.
Okay, last one. So the current chapter of Black Atlantis that I've just finished has taken on the format of a lecture performance called Retrograde Futurism, which is actually my favorite one of all, and also a film called À l'ombre de nos fantômes, or In the Shadow of Our Ghosts, that I've made with the Mauritanian artist Hameed Khan for like Simon said, for the last Dakar Biennial, and it's currently at the showroom in the current show called Working Practices. And what it does is it follows the story of a migrant ship that sailed in 2006. So I'll just say that and then show you a few minutes of it and then wind up. Maybe I can turn off the lights. Never quite presented them all together in this way, so I'm looking forward to whatever questions you have. Thank you.
And art edits the online journal The Ecological Citizen. She did her MFA here at Goldsmiths and will be starting a PhD in digital media art in October at the University of Plymouth Trans-Technology Research. Stephanie's just moved from London to the lovely Stroud in the southwest, where she intends to go hiking more often, hopefully with me.
Yeah.
Interests include sci-fi, freshwater pearl mussels, Irish Murdoch novels, rewilding, pizza, non-human cognition and sensory perception, paint, surrealist women and esoteric societies. So, welcome.
Thank you, Maggie. Thanks for inviting me. Okay, I've been thinking about what might constitute the radical decolonisation of thought and being, cultural, territorial, interspecies and ecological decolonisation, and how it might be performatively approached through an art practice. And I'm wondering, what do I mean by cultural, territorial, interspecies and ecological decolonisation of thought and being? Decolonisation is a term that's used a lot at the moment, often in relation to social justice and diversity. So I want to just define the term here and think about what it means a little bit to ground this. So it's generally used to mean the undoing of colonialism and colonial legacies, materially and theoretically, and the undoing of colonial legacies of thought that bias and stereotype approaches to, for example, race, culture, or nature. Or as Frans Fanon defines it, decolonization, which sets out to change the order of the world, is obviously a program of complete disorder, but it cannot come about as a result of magical practices, nor of natural shock, nor of friendly understanding. Decolonization, as we know, is a historical process. That is to say, it cannot be understood, it cannot become intelligible and clear to itself, except in the exact measure that we can discern the movements which give it historical form and content. So what does this mean in practical terms? During a stay in British Columbia a couple of years ago on a collaborative artistic research residency as part of the Skullcracker Suite project, I was specifically thinking about what decolonization means in the Canadian context, which is very much material territorial, and what I could learn from this. The Skullcracker Suite research residency, called BC Timeslip, The Empire Never Ended, at Dynamo Arts Association in Vancouver in August 2016, asked what would the decolonization of thought look or feel like. And it started with some reimaginations and reconstructions of Philip K. Dick's 1972 stay in Vancouver, which John Cousins is going to talk about more later, so I won't go into it too much. But Dick essentially gave his talk, The Android and the Human, and then spent several weeks checked into a rehab clinic for Indigenous ex-con addicts. So the group of us, me, John Cousins, Gregoire Dupont, and Steve Calvert, held screenings and encounter-style discussion groups with local artists and academics, both Indigenous and settlers, to try to understand the complex issues around the local, non-metaphorical context of decolonisation. We were recommended this text by Tuck and Yang, who say, the easy adoption of decolonising discourse by educational advocacy and scholarship, evidenced by the increasing number of calls to decolonise our schools, or use decolonising methods, or decolonise student thinking, turns decolonisation into a metaphor. The metaphorisation of decolonisation makes possible a set of evasions, or settler moves to innocence, that problematically attempt to reconcile settler guilt and complicity, and rescue settler futurity. Settler moves to innocence are those strategies or positionings that attempt to relieve the settler of feelings of guilt or responsibility, without giving up land or power or privilege, without having to change much at all. In fact, settler scholars may gain professional kudos or a boost in their reputations for being so sensitive or self-aware. Decolonisation offers a different perspective to human and civil rights-based approaches to justice, an unsettling one rather than a complementary one. Decolonisation is not an and, it is an elsewhere. So, for me, that sort of means decolonisation is an ideal, but it should be a lived practice. It should be uncomfortable and desettling. But essentially it requires that we decenter not only whiteness and privilege, but also the human and even the animal from thought and being. As Donna Haraway says, situated knowledges require that the object of knowledge be pictured as an actor and agent, not as a screen or a ground or a resource, never finally as a slave to the master that closes off the dialectic in his unique agency and his authorship of objective knowledge. Well, how might this even begin to be approached through an art practice? The Skullcracker Suite project led us to be invited to a potlatch ceremony on a reservation up the coast from Vancouver, where we were extremely fortunate to witness a performed knowledge form. And I can't say that I understood it entirely. I'm sure there will be lots of nuances and complexities that escaped me due to my cultural and linguistic lack of understanding. But it certainly transformed the way I think about relationships to other entities and the environment. The picture here is of the artist and shaman Bo Dick, who was the sort of leader of the dance floor. The clans performed ceremonial dances for over 12 hours that each enacted and transmitted particular information in complex embodied form. So there are some things that have to be experienced as a practitioner that make sense to me. This event takes place in the space of a longhouse or a big house, which is a sacred and community space. The dance floor is run by the Hamatsa Secret Society of Initiates, and there are strict rules governing who has the right to dance each dance. The dances included performed animals and non-human hyper-object-like beings such as earthquakes and thunder, often wearing heavy carved wooden masks, sometimes articulated masks. The Brazilian anthropologist Eduardo Viveiros de Castro, who Maggie mentioned earlier, talks about indigenous Amerindian relationships to non-human beings in his theory of perspectivism, how each being is given personhood. As he explains it, a wolf is a person to a wolf. And non-human beings within the local ecosystem are thought of as kin. He discusses what he calls a perspectivist encounter as an encounter with a completely other being, which could be anything else, anyone else, human, animal, other sorts of entities. You can't expect to have access to other beings. You can't expect to have access to their thought or feeling, but understanding is not necessary for kinship. He also talks about the way that embodied forms of myth function in these societies as a sort of immanent philosophical form. And I think from speaking with members of the Kwakwaka'wakw clan here and the people close to them, that the Northwest Coast indigenous potlatch functions similarly. And I guess I connect this to Orphan Drift's use of hyperstition and Simon O'Sullivan's writing and Plastique Fantastique's use of fictioning and myth science and their precursors in Afrofuturism. De Castro traces the roots of Deleuze and Guattari's thought to Amerindian philosophical influence, but he suggests that the original is far more complex and effective as a form that's embedded within the societies and lived, and not separate in the way that Western philosophy is. So I sort of relate this to Simon's writing on Laruelle, non-philosophy and art practice. And art, like philosophy, is mostly separate from society, but it is a form for embedded and experiential thought. For Donna Haraway, art and science can work together to think up new forms and new ways of working with non-human beings to form new kinship relationships. She uses speculative fictions to imagine different futures, and I'll come back to this later. The Skullcracker Suite retraced Philip K. Dick's steps, including to the Indigenous Rehab Clinic, ex-Calais, where he spent the weeks covering from his breakdown. Ex-Calais comes from a Kwakwaka'wakw word for path and stood for the unknown path. It's a therapeutic community inspired by the Sinan model, based on Carl Rogers' encounter group methodology for intensive durational group interaction. Encounter groups became popular in the 70s as a way of breaking down the usual polite social masks and facilitating intensive, uninhibited and honest group interaction. Carl Rogers' original encounter group methodology was developed in a therapeutic setting, but it has also been used for pedagogical conflict resolution and community living purposes. So Ex-Calais Rehab Community was set up for Indigenous ex-con addicts. It practiced a version of the synonym therapeutic model combined with a strictly abstinence-based rehab. Philip K. Dick's experience at Ex-Calais was paranoidly fictionalized in his 1977 novel A Scanner Darkly. The overlaps between De Castro's perspectivist encounter and Plastique Fantastique's use of encounter for fictioning and Carl Rogers' model led me to consider the potential of an encounter-style methodology for radical decolonisation, so not only cultural but also environmental. Thinking the encounter as a way to be confronted by radically different others and to think about new non-human kinship structures. I also want to consider the potential of technological non-anthropocentrism for ecological decolonisation and how post-human thought might be important to that. The picture here is from one of Carl Rogers' encounter sessions. You can watch a clip of it on YouTube. So I first tried an ecological encounter session last summer at Supernormal Supersensory Summer School Sanctuary, a performative collaborative research project at Supernormal Festival in Oxfordshire. We invited festival goers to a host of sensory encounters that drew inspiration from Braziers Park School of Integrative Social Research, the resident community of the site, and 20th century counterculture. So I was working with Charlie Fox, Britta Jenkins, Annabella Pollen, Chris Hind, and the Anti-University. My session, Unsafe Spaces of Encounter Culture, was an experiential reading session introducing the history of encounter groups, their use as therapeutic, communitarian and pedagogical spaces, and their potential for radical decolonisation through a cut-up narrative including sci-fi, ecological and intersectional theory texts, as well as Carl Rogers' writing, with accompanied by a sonic drone bath by musician Chris Hind. Sonic drone bath, a deep sonic drone sound. This was followed by an experimental encounter session with the participants. I suppose the important thing about encounter sessions is they're unstructured, but duration is really important, so usually at least an hour and a half, but often much longer. I used this experience and these ideas to inform my approach to the workshop for Maggie's exhibition Glimmer Breach at IMT. Swamp Living was a workshop collaboratively developed between Joseph Walsh, Kirsten Cook, Chris Hind, Maggie Roberts and myself. It was an experimental, immersive, interspecies, swampy becoming session, assisted by drone sound, movement and speculative fictioning, which took place within and drew upon the actants of Mayor Maggie Roberts' techno-shamanic exhibition environment, aiming to perform a tentacular distributed consciousness. So Joseph, sitting over there, led the meditative movement session, a series of guided exercises for becoming various elemental beings, from rivers to oil to steam to plants. I sort of moved into sharing cards, a set of cards that I'd produced based on my non-human Twitter and Instagram avatars. So at first people were reading aloud from the text on the cards, and then it moved into a drawing session, a group drawing session, based on the cards' scientific descriptions, hashtags and imagery, to speculatively invoke an interspecies being, a mix of human and freshwater pearl mussel. And these are some of the drawings that were produced. Then that moved into Kirsten's presentation, lecture performance. She read a story about algorithms and octopi with projected slides, based on and in conversation with Maggie's work. A previous iteration of that text is actually published in Res Gallery's Alembic exhibition catalogue, which launches on the 16th of June. Res Gallery in Deptford, just down the road. And throughout the session, Chris Hine provided a sonic drone bath again, using the sounds of animals and other non-human beings, which sort of resonated, vibrated through the floorboards of the space. So the workshop then repeated the first two sections backwards. So it was structured as a kind of wave, starting slowly and building up to the intensity of Kirsten's dance-charged lecture, and then decelerating to finish with Joseph's movements and ending lying on the floor. We wanted the workshop to flow and not have an overt leader, participant or teacher class structure. So we'd just start by doing things rather than instructing the group, and people were free to join in or not. I don't know if I'm going to be able to get to the film, but I think it's like film clips. So, the cards are based on my Instagram and Twitter avatar, Alien Ontology, which is also part of a bigger project. It's sort of, I suppose, the initial research and testing for the PhD project I'm going to begin in October to produce an experimental digital eco-sci-fi novel, which might not be exactly like a novel at all. But it's inspired by Donna Haraway's study of non-human kinship practices and a discussion of the potential of speculative fabulation and fan fictions from her recent book, Staying with the Trouble. Haraway's children of compost are symbiont or interspecies children, bodily modified with genes and microorganisms of endangered species. The children become sorts of guardians for their symbiont species, who they have a deep connection with. Haraway developed this speculative fiction as a collaboration. It started as a workshop that she was part of, which included Isabel Stengers. And she invites others to take the story up as a kind of fan fiction, which is, in a way, what I'm doing. But whereas Haraway tells these stories with a linear narrative structure, following generations of the children of compost, I want to use the children of compost to generate material around how these interspecies beings may actually experience and engage the world differently from their human kin. So I want to imagine what their cognition and sensory perception could be, to imagine non-human ways of being in the world and forming non-human kinship affinities. So I want to try and find ways to imagine and describe particular non-human beings, in this case freshwater pearl mussel, which is an endangered species local to Devon's River Torridge, and think through their cognition and sensory perception and behaviours, which is so the cards take text extracted from scientific papers and edited into micro-narratives for Twitter and hashtags for Instagram, with images of freshwater pearl mussels found online. I'm going to miss that out. So essentially I want to ask, how can digital platforms be repurposed for imaginatively inhabiting interspecies sensory perception and cognition? I want to work with I will be working with marine biologists and animal biologists to think this, so to sort of think this scientifically and think about actually what could be possible. What sort of cognition, sensory perception could an interspecies being, a cross between, say, a human and a freshwater pearl mussel be? But also, which I haven't really, I've sort of skipped a bit, but how can networked identity politics strategies be applied to open out and de-anthropicize the group, to use the group as a model for radical embrace of difference, rather than a closed identity-specific group? Thinking about disidentifying kinship structures for interspecies connections that don't rely on identification to generate sympathy through avatars and science fiction or speculative approaches, and appropriating networked media for object-oriented post-identity phenomenological artwork. And I think that's me.